Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this is a video on promises and just talking about how to use promises and create your own custom promises. Um, Promises are essentially a way to deal with asynchronous events in JavaScript. What does that mean? Basically, unless you're using promises, your code in JavaScript for the most part is synchronous, which means it runs in order. So if I do console, let's go in here in the thingy, console.log, hello, console.log, goodbye, console.log, farewell. Okay, now if I run this code, let's save that. And see, it runs the 3 lines of code and it runs them in the order that they're in the code. But maybe there's something I want to do like right here that might take like a minute or two. Problem with that is someone who's on my website or someone who's using my software, they don't necessarily want to wait a minute or two before the rest of my code does whatever it's doing. Especially if it doesn't need that to be finished right away. So what a promise does, allows me to sit there and create a block of code that instead of waiting for a value to be returned, it returns an object called the promise. And the promise says, hey, I don't have this information yet. I eventually will. So once that information arrives, come check in with me and I'll have it. Okay? So, but in the meantime, when it sees that a promise is returned, it'll continue on and just continue on with the code. So first, let's talk about how do you create a promise. So let's just say we want to save our promise in a variable. Const my promise equals a new promise. Okay, that's the object. Now in the constructor of the object gets passed a callback. Now that callback takes 2 parameters, which are really functions: a response object and a rejection object. So the response object is essentially a function that says, hey, I got what I wanted. Here's the thing that you were waiting for. The rejection function is, oh yeah, things didn't quite work out the way I expected them to, so here's me telling you what went wrong. Okay? So that's what those 2 things are. And then I create a function. And here I can describe all the things that it's going to do. And then use these 2 functions to tell me when it's done. So this actually doesn't return any kind of value. It's just eventually going to use that res or reg function. And I just call them res or reg. You can call them whatever you want, but it's always response and then rejection. Cool. So what I'm going to do is we'll just do this. We'll just say if the number is even, we get a response, and if the number is odd, then I get pass in a thing. Let's just do this. If we'll just say if true for right now. If true, we're gonna do res. Hey, this worked. We're just gonna return the string. It worked. Okay, and if it's false, we'll say reg. This did not work. Okay. And essentially that's the deal. Res reg, and I'm just running the function depending on what happens. Cool. So what happens is that the promise waits to be resolved. Once the promise is resolved, I can then chain off of it these .then functions. Okay, these .then functions run if there's a res, in a sense, if the res runs. So it basically, what happens is it gets that response, it gets the value that's returned by res, so it works. So that would be my response. And then I can pass a callback to do whatever I want with it. So we'll console.log response. Now, if something goes wrong, then I can chain a.catch. So you generally want to do both. Catch is what happens when something goes wrong. So you get the reg runs. So in this case, I pass another callback, and this will give me back my error, which would be this did not work. Okay, and then I just put in a callback. Console.log the error. And there we go. So I have this set to true already, so it should automatically resolve successfully. And then console log response. So it should say, hey, it works if I did this right. Let's see. Yep, there it goes. It works. Okay, so a promise was resolved, and then the .then only runs once the response as actually happens. Now let's say I change this to false. And actually, just to make this clear, I'm going to put 1 so you can see that it's all coming through a separate function. So in this case, it's going to, when the error comes through, it's going to have the number 2 in it, so you can see that it's coming from this callback, not this callback. Save. No testing. Oops, I didn't change it to false. False. Save. Okay, so this did not work. Cool. Okay, so that's, so you can see you, and why would you want to do this? Why would you want to create, like, let's say you have something that's going to happen that's going to take a while, or could take a while. So this is like, for example, a good example of this is the fetch function in the browser that fetches from an API, fetches an API call. So you're making a GET request or a PUT request to some API somewhere. That could take a while, depending on the API and the speed of the API or how complicated the API call is. That could take a couple milliseconds. That could take a couple seconds. That's why those are built around promises, and you have to do all the .thens after them. Technically, set state in React is asynchronous. Why? Because the things that set state does triggers a re-rendering of the DOM. These things might take a while, okay, depending on how complicated your application is. So instead of holding up your whole application every time you want to change your state in React, it uses a promise. So that way that thing goes to happen, and you can go do other things while that's, you know, doing its thing. So promises are a good way to say, hey, I have this process that may take some time in my code, but I don't necessarily want to stop all of my program from running. Let things keep going. Okay? So for example, let's just show you an example. So if I were to put a console log here outside of the promise, hello. So notice this hello is all the way at the bottom. Despite that, it should run before this .then or .catch. Why? Because it's asynchronous. So it's going to hit the promise is going to hit first, and it will skip this block of code because it realizes it's a promise, runs this first, and then comes back around. So it's a loop. It comes back around and checks the .then, checks to see if the promise is resolved, and then we'll run it once it's resolved. So let's see here. So it should say hello first, even though it's down here, and then say, in this case, the error, because I haven't changed it back to true. So, okay, and see, hello came up first. Because the minute it sees the promise unresolved, it skips it, does the rest of it, goes through the rest of your code, and then will revisit it, or periodically revisit it, and once it sees that it resolves, will then do the chained .then, or the chained .catch if it failed. Okay, so essentially, that's what's going on with the promise. Cool, 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 cool. Now, just to kind of show you this a little bit more clearly, let's what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a set timeout, which means it runs a function after a period of time. So we're going to say at the end of 5 seconds, we're going to respond. We're going to resolve the promise with the number 5. Okay, that's what you get back. And this will happen after 5 seconds. So 5,000 milliseconds. Okay, But what I'm going to do is I'm going to set interval. I'm going to do a set interval, which runs a function every certain amount of time. So that function will be, okay, set interval. I want to run. What am I going to do? Oh, I want to console log the promise. So console.log my promise. So that way you can see that the promise is pending until it gets that resolved. And again, this is not going to resolve for 5 seconds because technically the promise runs. It waits for the set timeout to hit 5 seconds, which then sends a response. So until then, the promise is pending. So if I do this, okay, and then do no testing, see, pending, 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 and now it's 5. You can see it's just looping over again. Oh, and I never actually specified an interval. So that's why I was like doing it so quickly. Let's do it like 1,000. So that's every second. So you can kind of see it. So see, pending, 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 pending. Oh, now we have, there was a response. And see, now the promise resolved and gave you back 5. Okay, cool. So that's kind of how a promise works. But here's the thing, oftentimes in these .thens you'd be doing like another thing that returns a promise and another thing that returns a promise. So you end up with these big lists of .thens being chained off to each other. So it got a little funky. Okay, so what they did is they created what's called async await for situations where a promise would normally be returned. Okay, so basically the way it would work, you'd have to create a function. So essentially it's the same thing. It's just we're going to create a function. Let me see how I want to clean this up. Okay, so the way this would work is I would create a function. So we'll say my const async await. I'll just say const test equals, and then I would put the async keyword before the parameters if I'm doing an arrow function. And that tells JavaScript that this is an async function, which means that promises are involved, which will allow me to use the await keyword. Okay? So now what I can do is I can do something like this. Const response equals await. And then I can just actually copy this promise. Cut. Put that there. Okay, what's it complaining about? Expression expected equals async. Yeah, that looks fine to me. See here, new await promise. Yeah, that looks fine. Okay, oh, but it's waiting for this. Okay, so let's get rid of that. Save. So this creates a function. And this function, I'm able to use as a await keyword. So instead of having to do this then after the promise resolves, the await just says, when the promise resolves, put the resolution in here. The only problem with this is there's no way to do a .catch. So what if it fails? What do I do? Well, this is where try catch blocks become useful. I mean, try catch blocks are also just good in general. But if you're using async await, then you might want to just basically put your code in try catch blocks. And what that does is I'll say, hey, this code, I want you to try it. I don't think it did what I wanted to do. Let me highlight this here. Curly bracket. There we go. So try this code, and if it fails, then catch. Then we'll pass in a parameter called error. So it's really a function I'm defining. And we'll console.log the error if something goes wrong. So that's another way to catch a failed promise. Okay, but now I have this response variable, and I can just console.log response like normal. Because what's going to happen is that this function, since I told it it's async await, it actually does wait for this response before this function continues moving forward. Okay, so basically it treats this asynchronous action kind of as a synchronous step within the context of the function, but it still allows the rest of your code to continue moving forward until that resolution happens. So if I hit test here, okay, let's see what happens. So we'll run the code. Okay. Save. And see, it just kind of waits. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oop, now I got an error. Let's see here. Unhandled promise rejection warning. Response is not defined. Where did we do that? Const response. Oh, because I defined response in this try block. So I need to move this over here. Block scoping. Ooh. I like block scoping, but try catch blocks always catch me with that. Okay. Let's try that again, but you kind of saw how like it didn't run that console.log until after the promise was complete. Because async await basically says, hey, even though the rest of the world, so basically if I did another console log down here, console.log hello, that'll run. But again, the rest of the function in the code in the function doesn't run until the promise resolves. So see, hello ran. So the rest of your code is still asynchronous, but the code inside your async await function, even though there's promises, is treated synchronously, which is pretty cool. Okay, so that's how that works. And that's it. That's all. That's promises in a nutshell. Hopefully this makes promises make more sense to you. I know this was very confusing to me for the very longest time. But once you see it, it's not so bad. It's pretty useful. And again, it can be used when you have processes that might otherwise hold up the speed of your program. Okay, and especially if moving forward with your code doesn't necessarily depend on that thing completing right away. Okay, so have a great day. My name is Alex Merced from Alex Merced Coder. Make sure to head over to devnursery.com so that way you can go join the Slack community and the Discord community and meet other developers and have cool conversations. And subscribe to the YouTube channel. Ciao.